In the mid part of the 1800s, America was being ripped apart. Political, cultural, economic, moral differences were forcing apart the North and the South. Neighbor would turn on neighbor, brother on brother. In fewer places was this more apparent than in the border states. Some states choosing not to secede, but also not joining the Confederacy. Kentucky never seceded, even though there were many within its borders who felt Southern sympathies. Even within Nelson County, we had sons fighting fathers, brothers fighting brothers, neighbor against neighbor. We were a nation, a state, a county divided.
In the fall of 1862, the Battle of Perryville is over. Morgan has come riding through Nelson County, capturing wagon trains, and all the Confederate troops now have withdrawn and are going south, leaving burned bridges, the railroad trestles are down, the mail can't get through, and the people of Bardstown and Nelson County are having problems. In December, a lot of excitement took place here in Bardstown, Nelson County. The newspaper started reporting that John Hunt Morgan, coming from the south, was bringing troops back into Kentucky. And anytime you heard John Hunt Morgan was coming, everybody got excited. John Hunt Morgan's career was really on the upswing here in December of 1862. He and his troops had captured 1,834 Union troops at Hartsville, Tennessee. And in recognition of this, he was promoted on the 13th of December to Brigadier General. So he truly was a general, John Hunt Morgan. He started on his Christmas raid into Kentucky on December 22nd. He didn't just cross the border down south and wander through the woods. He came in with 4,000 troops, 4,000 cavalrymen, riding their fine horses, coming up into Kentucky to cause trouble. That's the way that his campaigns were. He harassed the Union soldiers, and his goal was to take Union soldiers from the front lines, from places they were fighting in Virginia or even Tennessee and all, and that the Union officials had to order them to go and catch Morgan. He was the prey, and he was the one who was going to cause everybody to ride in circles, trying to figure out what he's going to do and where he's going to be. 20,000 troops during this time period were deployed here in the West trying to catch Morgan. 4,000 troops holding up 20,000, that's success in a war. When he came into Kentucky, his goal again was to burn trestles. When you interrupt the supply lines, and the railroads were the supply lines, you burn the trestles, you tear down the telegraph lines, that's your lines of communication, and you kind of incite the Kentuckians who are truly Southern sympathizers, strong Southern sympathizers, to stand up and wave their flags and hang them back up and really show that they are supporting the South. As they came east with his troops, they're crossing the ford on the Rolling Fork River, which is directly west of Boston, Kentucky. They're crossing the ford and they have split up. They've got 2 or 3 units that they're going to send one over to New Haven. They've sent another one up the river, as you do in war. And you put your scouts out, and you also just kind of get a lay of the land. But they're taking their artillery, their cannon and all. They've got to cross at a ford that they can drag that heavy cannon across. They can't just jump in the water and swim like you might do. They're crossing the ford when the Union troops come up behind them, and they surprise them. Half of the force was on the east side of the river, and the other half is still on the west. They call back one of their units to come and start fighting from the east side across the river so that the other men could cross over. It was successful in that most of the men got crossed over, but there were some men captured of Morgan's group. The biggest problem, or the biggest effect of that battle, was that Basil Duke, who was Morgan's second in command, his right-hand man, as you'd say, also his brother-in-law. Basil Duke had married John Hunt Morgan's sister in 1861, so he hadn't been married very long. He was considered the stable one, the one who was the one to depend on, the calm thinker. Morgan was considered the flamboyant headline grabber, but Duke was the one who truly kept the troops and the aim, the goal of Morgan's units in line. Basil Duke was wounded. He was unconscious, and that knowledge swept through the men. No, there wasn't any question about how serious it was. It was a head wound, and since he was unconscious, they didn't know how bad it was. They went to a local farmer, commandeered a wagon, put a feather bed in it, and put Duke in the feather bed and rode to Bardstown. And they took him to Dr. Cox's house. Dr. Cox lived on North 3rd Street on the road that led to Louisville. He had a fine 2-story brick house. They took him upstairs in the north bedroom. They laid a heavy pallet on the floor. And the wound was on the right side of the head, and when the doctor washed the blood from it, Reverend Cunningham was invited to examine the cannon's work. The wound was supposed to have been made by a small piece of bursted shell of a small cannon. A piece of the skin and bone behind the ear were gone. If the direction of the flying bit of shell had been directly from the right of the victim, it would have passed through the lower part of the head and death would have been instantaneous. As I bent over the prostrate warrior, looking at his wound, he said in a somewhat cheerful tone, "That was a pretty close call." He did not complain or in any way indicate that his wound was a painful one. His wound was dressed. He was kept overnight there, December 29th, and taken care of, and the next day, again, he was put in a wagon and taken away, going with Morgan's unit as they left. Morgan's men were not under control here in Bardstown. And that was an understatement, I think. When they all thronged into town, they had been in a battle at the ford. They were excited. They began going up and down all the streets. And of course, they went in the stores to get supplies or pick up something. And of course, we had saloons here. As they went around, they got mad. They were angry. This was Kentucky, a southern town, a southern state, and they were supposed to be welcomed. What was happening, the merchants said, "We can't take your money." Confederate money was not very good in Kentucky. You didn't get the value for it, and they refused to take the money. Now, some of the merchants actually ended up offering things to them, but it made the soldiers mad that they wouldn't accept the money, and the next thing you knew, they just took the items. Morgan's men weren't dressed in regular uniforms all the time. They kind of put on what they had, what they were comfortable in, and they had an attitude of, you know, we ride with John Hunt Morgan, we're special. And in this case, they didn't make many friends in Bardstown that night. And some say if Basil Duke had not been wounded, the discipline would have been enough that this would not have happened. It left some hard feelings against the Confederate soldiers. Even those Southern sympathizers who normally would have been welcoming were pretty much closing their doors at this point. This wasn't a disciplined army, this was rabble. And they knew how to handle rabble, was to get away from it. On December 29, 1862, the same day that they crossed the ford, Colonel Chennault destroyed the stockade at Boston and marched on to Bardstown. When he got to Bardstown, one of the things they did was open the jail. Freed all the prisoners who were claiming to be Southern sympathizers accused of stealing horses. Others burglarized the post office. Again, these were not very popular moves and caused the atmosphere to be very bad. But some of the group of Morgan went south to New Haven. By December 30th, the next day, they attacked the 78th Illinois Infantry. This was a Union group in New Haven that were about 80 members inside a stockade. Now, a stockade wasn't a huge fort. It was a fortified area that they would retreat into when they were trying to defend an area. And they were all around the railroad tracks. Up and down Kentucky, there were areas for the Union troops to go into for protection when they were attacked by the Confederates. Colonel Bennison had strict orders to stay on the defensive. He was the Union commander there, and not to go more than 300 yards from the stockade. They were approached on that morning by a flag of truce, demand to surrender, and these were the cavalrymen of Colonel John H. Morgan. Captain Housley was in charge of this group. Well prepared and with the advantage of a position, a strong position, the Union officer respectfully declined. The Confederates moved to a wooded ridge, and they moved a single 12-pounder mountain howitzer. They moved in position 1,000 yards away in the meadow, and they started bombarding the stockade. 3 companies of the Confederate 9th Cavalry drew up into a battle line. They were going to charge the stockade. The bombardment began, but they actually never hit the stockade. They hit some buildings in New Haven. They overshot the stockade and ended up hitting 2 of the buildings in New Haven, but they never hit the stockade. When the mounted men got closer to the action, they dismounted and hid their horses behind some buildings. The Federals put up a spirited defense and had the advantage of a well-prepared position. The exchange of shots was over in about 90 minutes, with the Confederates withdrawing with 2 or 3 dead and 10 to 12 wounded. As the troops withdrew, and as Basil Duke rode off, resting in his wagon on his feather bed, and John Hunt Morgan and his other officers gathered up their freewheeling, thieving, plundering soldiers, and they started east to go on to continue their raid for one more day as they continued the Christmas raid in Kentucky and as they withdrew to Tennessee. 1862, we finished the year with battle, wounds, some successful attacks and others not so successful. But we are 2 years into a war that a lot of people really wished we had never started.